Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary Cooloff, the President of the Royal Society of Tasmania, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here tonight to our Christmas function and lecture. Tonight we are meeting on the country of the First Nations of Lutruwita, Tasmania. The Royal Society of Tasmania acknowledges with deep respect the traditional owners of this land and the ongoing custodianship of the Aboriginal people of Tasmania. We pay respect to elders past and present. We acknowledge that Tasmanian Aboriginal people have survived severe and unjust impacts resulting from invasion and dispossession of their country. As an institution dedicated to the advancement of knowledge, the Royal Society of Tasmania recognises Aboriginal cultural knowledge and practices. We seek to respect and honour these traditions and the deep understanding they represent. So tonight's lecture is presented by Professor Greg Lehman. Professor Lehman is a past council member of the Royal Society of Tasmania and he's a founding member of our Aboriginal Engagement Committee. Greg was appointed Pro-Vice-Chancellor Aboriginal Leadership at the University of Tasmania in January 2020. He is an award-winning curator and writer, a well-known Tasmanian art historian, and a regular public commentator on identity and place. Greg is descended from the Turulurri people of northeast Tasmania. Before completing a Masters of Studies in the History of Art and Visual Cultures at the University of Oxford and a PhD in Art History at the University of Tasmania, I must say you sound very busy, Greg. Greg majored in Life Sciences and Geography at UTas. He convened Native Solutions, Indigenous Knowledge and Fire Management, which was Tasmania's first international symposium on the role of cultural burning in natural area conservation. Greg has also worked as a successful curator, for example, for the exhibition of First Tasmanians, for the National Picture, The Art of Tasmania's Black War, and most recently for Too Many Cooks at the Plimsoll Gallery at the University of Tasmania. Greg's talk tonight is on the topic Terra nullius in Tasmanian colonial art. So please join me in welcoming Professor Greg Lehman.
Thank you very much, Mary. It is a busy life, but there's lots to do. And as my brother often says, you're dead a long time, so you've got to make the most of it. Thank you, Mary. Now, unfortunately, for those in the back of the room, this presentation is a visually rich one, and I'll be speaking to images of quite a few colonial paintings. So I hope that those at the back can make out the screen. But please feel free to pull your pew up a little bit closer if you're inclined. Public awareness and enthusiasm for the landscape works of John Glover, featuring Tasmanian Aboriginal people in rapturous celebration of their culture, have created, I would argue, a distorted understanding of the place of Aboriginal people in the painted colonial landscapes of Van Diemen's Land. My research over recent years, culminating in the 2017 National Gallery of Australia touring exhibition, The National Picture, has highlighted what I call a curious absence of Aboriginal people in picturesque landscape scenes prior to John Glover's arrival in the colony. Curious because this is precisely the time that Aboriginal resistance was at its most energetic. In this talk, I'd like to explore some key questions about the presence and absence of Aboriginal people in the colonial visual archive and draw attention to the value of colonial art not simply as a graphic accompaniment to written history, but as an invaluable and underappreciated source of historical understanding of some underappreciated processes at play in the establishment of our nation's foundations. A more critical understanding of the context of artwork depicting Aboriginal people and the colonial landscape enables us to reveal some of the rhetorical functions that officially sanctioned art served in the establishment and development of the colony. Colonial art as visual rhetoric played an essential role, I will argue, in positioning Aboriginal people in the colonial imagination, in terms not only of the acknowledgement, of a lack of acknowledgement of the rights that they should be accorded, but of the most basic form of recognition, their visibility. When French navigators and artists arrived in Van Diemen's Land, the noble savages that they depicted were more complex representations than those usually referred to in popular histories. Their depiction carried a rich cultural and literary heritage, with a wide palette of thematic aspects or variations of noble savagery from which to choose. The Tasmanian Aborigines that the French saw could be considered as heroic and beyond servitude to civil rule and all its corrupting influences, especially according to Rousseau, property. They could be seen as a reflection of French disillusionment with institutional power and the corruption of society by injustice. They also symbolised an heroic and untamed nobility with sovereign rights to nature, leading a virtuous existence beyond colonial rule. They could be seen as a remnant of the Golden Age, and through mortality in common with the civilised European, offer hope of a return to lost freedoms. Alongside all of this, they could also represent a disparate and primitive hard savagery from which Europeans could reassuringly distinguish themselves. In 1688, the buccaneer William Dampier arrived with the first Englishman to land on the shores of New Holland. Dampier's writing proved to be influential on both the expectations and attitudes of future European expeditions to what was soon to become one of the British Empire's most prized possessions in the Indian Pacific. Dampier's eventual celebrity was due not only to his career as a privateer, but also his success as a publicist. His focus on observation, collecting and publication reflected this and ensured that his narrative, entitled A New Voyage Around the World, published in 1697, was widely read afterwards. In this publication, which ran to multiple editions, Dampier famously remarked that the inhabitants of this country are the most miserable people in the world. Setting aside their human shape, they differ but little from brutes. This severe first impression was to be echoed nearly a century later, influencing the impressions and conclusions of Captain James Cook, Marion Dufresne and even Nicolas Bourdin. Dampier, on visiting the northwest coastline of Australia in 1699, initiated an understanding of Australian Aborigines that would persist for the next 3 centuries and arguably is still with us today. These ideas, reinforced by the observations of highly respected and experienced authorities such as Joseph Banks, created a profound and persistent view that Australian Aborigines could be considered as exceptions to the British experience of other native people in command of their territories. An expectation was established that rather than being able to exert any influence over nature, Aboriginal people were entirely at its mercy. This was also suitably convenient for colonists, who were therefore freed of any complication that proceeded from displacing people involved in recognisable and therefore legitimate possession of their territory. It was as though Aborigines had never actually occupied their lands, but were simply inconvenient and incongruous placeholders in territories awaiting discovery as latently English. Explorers peeled back the landscape's mystery to give way to the colonial imagination and its capacity to form itself into pastoral familiarity. But it was with an implicit sense of emptiness that the colonies were most readily apprehended. an unstable state inherently available for completion. The sense of emptiness did not relate only to civilization or terra nullius, but to any sensible story of its own. James Erskine Calder expressed this succinctly when he was writing about Van Diemen's Land in the 1840s. The country, wrote Calder, we describe is as yet without a history, without traditions, and indeed without association. Its past is a veritable blank, and we look back into it only to discover that it has nothing to reveal. There is no such thing as classical soil here. The idea that the British had arrived in a place with no history offered opportunities not only for building a new world from scratch, but also to reset the clock. Van Diemen's Land was proposed through picturesque representations as a kind of Eden, a new beginning for British settlers. This is elegantly captured in 1824 by Joseph Lycett when he published his Views in Australia. He wrote in the preface, "In contemplating the progressive effects of colonisation, even slightly as they are sketched in these pages and exhibited in the following views, the mind is naturally led into reflections upon the origin and decay of nations. In these infant settlements of Australia, we probably behold the germs of a mighty empire, which in future ages will pour forth its myriads to repeople future deserts, in those very regions from which the pabellum of their own existence is at present drawn. What was the state in which the Aboriginals of Britain appeared 2,000 years ago to Caesar, when Rome's legions first beheld our chalky cliffs? If then such was England, what may not Australia be?" Early Australian landscape painters used the picturesque style to work as place markers in an unfamiliar land. Through the publication of their work as engravings, the centre of empire was able to define itself in contrast to its expanding fringe, naming and claiming new domains. Paul Carter argues that the picturesque aesthetic is inherently involved in the appropriation of land. The picturesque, he writes, is thoroughly entwined with notions of nature's use value and the need to appropriate its wealth. Indeed, the language of scientific and picturesque study is a language of appropriation. Colonial landscape painters acted in the same way as map makers, rendering a landscape familiar and recognisable to European frameworks of value and of use. The picturesque landscape, says Paul Miller, appears as a culturally constructed aesthetic. It is a landscape to which a cultural identity is applied. The role of Aborigines in this re-enculturated landscape needed to be closely defined, serving the particular needs of patrons and viewers of the resulting images. The beginnings of the picturesque in Australia can be seen in the work of Thomas Watling during the beginnings of this in the 1790s. Joseph Lycett subtitled his 1824 publication Picturesque Views in an attempt to appeal to this increasingly popular reception. The picturesque approach, which we see employed throughout the late 18th and early 19th century in the colonies of New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, offered a convenient rhetorical place for Aborigines in a visual narrative that sought to relegate them as a preceding moment in an inevitable process of colonial progress. Depictions of Aborigines in the Sydney colony are of essential importance in understanding the development of these patterns and practices. John Lewin's 1808 topographical view, Sydney Cove, is an exemplary study in the use of Aboriginal figures in extolling the success of colonisation through picturesque painting. The extent of the colony is impressive and contrasts with a naked Aboriginal figure carrying a spear and placed just off-centre in his regard of a large three-masted vessel hauled up on the shore for careering. The primitiveness of the original inhabitants is emphasised by two more Aboriginal figures in a canoe, dwarfed by the bulk of the ship. The Aboriginal people in these views seem content to practice their daily pursuits, fishing from the shore, carrying lighted fires in their canoes. It is the epitome of a successful, happy and domesticated colony. When Lieutenant Governor William Patterson returned to Sydney from Van Diemen's Land in 1809 to replace William Bligh, he asked John Lewin to make copies of a series of drawings and watercolours by the Tasmanian surveyor George Harris. His drawing of a view of Colonel Patterson's garden, Yorktown, from 1808, illustrates Patterson's assertion that the district was one of the most beautiful countries in the world, demonstrating what he called the settlement's rapid domesticity, tamed by art and design. This achievement is further emphasised in the painting A Bengal Cow and her calf English cross, 1 year old, demonstrating the productivity and fine breeding so symbolic of imperial industry. Of course, it would not be expected that either Patterson's garden or Bengal cow would include a Tasmanian Aboriginal person in the picture. This juxtaposition was inconceivable, given that it was the need for land to graze such beasts that necessitated the removal of Aborigines, not to mention that Aboriginal people were known to spear cattle and sheep in their resistance to British invasion. Instead, Bengal cow can be seen as a symbol of the displacement of Aboriginal people from the landscape. Similarly, the fences, roads and other signs of agricultural domesticity in Patterson's garden also provide signs of exclusion. The inclusion of landscape, fences, roads, homesteads and pastoral workers was therefore a presence in these picturesque views that was a statement of Aboriginal absence. Several of Lewin's Tasmanian landscapes of 1809 include Europeans engaged in activities such as fishing and boating. Of these views, one compares closely with an earlier watercolour by Evans, a view near Gross Head, New South Wales. This painting was owned by Patterson and most likely was seen by Lewin. Both views freely utilise common European criteria of picturesque and sublime to engage with elements of the Australian wilds. Evans does this not only through the dramatic topographical features of the landscape, but also by placing Aborigines, one holding a spear, in silhouette against the foaming rapids. Lewin's remarkably similar Second Cataract version of this view repeats many of the compositional and dynamic elements, but pointedly chooses Europeans with long fishing poles instead of Aborigines. However, the replacement of Aboriginal figures in the landscape is likely to be for more profound reasons than to simply emphasise the pleasure to be obtained in a Van Diemen's Land view. The effect is to diminish the sense of wildness and provide an assurance of security. It may be that the absence of Aborigines in Lewin's Van Diemen's Land scenes was coincidental. However, it seems much more likely that there was a desire on the part of Patterson in commissioning these artworks to focus more deliberately on the domestication of Van Diemen's Land scenes. This was easily achieved by simply removing reminders of Aboriginal people completely. An alternative to this is that perhaps Aborigines, artists were simply depicting what they saw and there were no Aborigines to be seen in Port Dalrymple or in Hobart Town. However, even a brief survey of colonial histories confirms Aboriginal people as a significant part of the experience of settlers at that time. At Port Dalrymple, this contact began from the earliest times with encounters in the locality of the Cataract continuing up until at least the mid-1820s. Similarly, Aborigines were regular visitors to Hobart Town over this time, often camping close to or within the town. These people became known as the Tame Mob and numbered between 20 or 30 men, women and children. In 1824, at the time of the publication of Lycett's Views of Australia, when no Aborigines were to be seen in colonial landscapes, James Boyce notes that a large group of over 60 Aborigines were visiting Hobart and camping on the outskirts of the town. It was after this time that settlers began to insist on exclusive enjoyment of their land grants and started to try to drive Aboriginal people away. No doubt a critical point in the escalation of conflict that ultimately culminated in the declaration of martial law in the colony. One of the earliest known paintings of European settlement in Van Diemen's Land is a view of Sullivan's Cove, 1804, thought to be by Evans, the surveyor. This scene shows the beginnings of a camp on Hunter Island, where two groups of tents are the only signs of land-based facilities, and a team of men working with a hand-drawn cart. A ship and longboat stand at anchor nearby. A small flock of gulls is the only sign of local inhabitants. The importance of landscape studies so commonly produced at this early time in the colony's history was to fold landscapes that were admired by those responsible for the success of colonial development into a European aesthetic that would be easily read by cultured people. According to Richard Neville, a landscape that could be so easily turned into a picture was also proof of its value. Decisions on whether or not to place Aboriginal people in these pictures was almost certainly made with intention. So why did early artists not employ this device in Van Diemen's Land? The rocks in the foreground of Sullivan's Cove are perfectly suited to the placement of Aborigines according to the picturesque orthodoxy that was practiced by this same artist in Sydney at the same time. Perhaps the best known of the early topographical artists to produce views of Van Diemen's Land is Joseph Lycett. Lycett may have accompanied Governor Macquarie on his visit to Tasmania between April and July 1821, although there's a lack of expected evidence to support this. While John McPhee concludes that G.W. Evans is most likely the source of the original material that Lycett then copied, this is not an explanation for the absence of Aborigines in any of his Van Diemen's Land views. But regardless of whether Lycett actually visited this island, it remains striking that his publications present the Tasmanian colony as devoid of natives. A comparison of Lycett's view of Port Macquarie, a location north of Newcastle, and view of the River Tamar, north of Hobart, is instructive. Both of these views are of locations at some distance from the colonial centre, where the danger of Aboriginal resistance might be greatest. Compositionally, the scenes are very similar, with figures on the shore gesturing to a sailing vessel just offshore. In fact, the vessel depicted in both views is identical, no doubt taken from a common sketchbook. The key difference is that while the figures in Port Macquarie are Aboriginal, those in the Tamar River view are all European. John McPhee remarks on the function of such symbols. These embellishments, he says, emphasise the extent and impact of European settlement and the safety of settlers, and must have been very deliberately added, not just to emphasise the picturesque elements of the landscape, but to appeal to potential investors and settlers. A similar comparison can be made of Lycett's view of the Heads and Mount Nelson. We can see in both these images, not so clearly on the top of Mount Nelson, but those of you who know Mount Nelson will know that there's a signal station there. It does feature in the painting in its detail, and a signal station on the Heads. The difference, of course, and consistently, is that while there are Aboriginal figures in the foreground of the New South Wales scene, the figures in the foreground of the Van Diemen's Land scene are typically domestic. There's a soldier in his red coat, symbolising security, and he's promenading with a lady, creating a perfect picture of security and safety. Kenneth Clarke's romantic definition of landscape ties this analysis in neatly with the imperative for capital development. It is this new image of white settlers in harmony with a bountiful nature that produced the first sustained pastoral imagery and, at the same time, the first images of private property. The establishment of private land was an important step in guaranteeing a thriving colony. Land, once under government control, had then to be taken up and proven to be productive. The task of the landscape artist during this period was to document and promote this process. The preceding necessity to alienate that land from the original owners need not be in question, especially when Aboriginal figures that might raise such uncomfortable issues at a time of continuing resistance to European invasion were banished from these views. In 1824, the extent of displacement of Aborigines from their country had escalated conflict, which worsened with every settler attack on the Aboriginal families that had been forcibly driven from their land grants. Worse, the frightening spectre of bushranging had been reawakened with a report in the Hobart Town Gazette in 1823 that 2 Aborigines had led the tame mob on a rampage against stockkeepers, killing 5 in 3 separate incidents. Sharon Morgan considers that a degree of paranoia had taken hold of many settlers at the time. According to Linda Ryan, these incidents were associated with widespread panic in the colony. Aborigines, who had once been dismissed as little more than apes, had now to be taken seriously as a potential threat to the colony's success and viability. It is likely that, in response to this developing situation, Lycett's views of Australia paid careful attention to Aboriginal presence in the troubled colony of Van Diemen's Land by bracketing them off completely from the colonists' world. In my research for the National Picture Exhibition, I was able to find only one image by an unknown artist of Aboriginal people in the Van Diemen's Land landscape that was produced during the period when conflict and fear was at its height. This image, I haven't managed to pin it down to an exact location, but we can easily imagine from the title that it's on the upper Derwent estuary. But most importantly, what we see here are 2 Aboriginal figures armed with spears, hiding behind a tree. One of them is peering around the side of the tree and looking across the river. If we have a look at a detail of the painting, we see why those Aboriginal people are hiding behind the tree. This was at a time that martial law had been declared in the colony, and it was entirely legal to shoot Aborigines on sight if they were seen within the settled districts. We can see here contingents of soldiers on the high ground above a work gang of convicts, and soldiers also to the left and the right. I'm just going to skip over these, sorry. The only other colonial painting known to have been produced to depict frontier conflict is associated with an event that became known as the attack on Milton Farm. In this incident, John Allen, who had been granted land near Bushy Creek, was attacked on the 14th of December 1828, and his hut and crops were burned. Importantly, as I'll explain in a minute, this was not completed until 1833, so it's not actually a painting that was created during that critical time of conflict, but completed afterwards. Those of you who know a little bit about this painting will also know that there's a sketch created just after the incident in the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and a corresponding sketch in the Mitchell Library in Sydney. My conclusion is that during the escalating level of conflict on the island during the early 1820s, evidenced by a flood of letters sent home by settlers and in official correspondence, wrestling with the challenge of protecting the lives of both settler and Aborigine alike, any attempt to depict Tasmanian Aborigines as passive and unopposed to British settlement, as they were in New South Wales, would have been useless. Instead, another response seems to have been employed. It's difficult to imagine that artists such as Lycett could have come up with the idea of banishing any reminder of the current conflict from their paintings. There would have been no benefit for them ideologically or financially, unless this was a direct instruction from those commissioning their work, or a demand for such depiction according to the taste of their audience. Lycett, of course, was in the service of the governor during his time in Sydney. The only surviving letter by the artist, written to Wilmot Horton, the Undersecretary to Earl Bathurst in 1824, hints at the purpose of his publication. In the letter, he requests that the material for publication be passed on to the Earl for his inspection, so that it might be appropriately dedicated to his name. Endorsement of the work at such a level ensured that it would be influential and effectively secured it as an authoritative tool in promoting the success of the colony. This is in fact Van Diemen, or Tasmania's first ever real estate prospectus. Simply put, Lycett's brief was likely to have been to calm the perception of the colony in the face of increasing conflict, and in so doing attract more settlers with which to overwhelm increasing Aboriginal resistance, and importantly to bring capital into the colony. Research by John McPhee provides a tantalising suggestion that the Van Diemen's Land Company had been actively seeking to overcome negative assessments of the investment potential of the land that had been made available by Governor Sorrell. The company was intent on investing in grazing operations in the north of the island. To do this, they planned to secure large land grants, which required Bathurst's agreement. John McPhee cites company minutes from 1824 stating that, quote, "It was therefore necessary to satisfy Lord Bathurst that Colonel Sorrell was mistaken to which purpose." The minutes go on to resolve that a number of people involved in mercantile promotion of Van Diemen's Land be contacted to further this project. The list includes the name of Joseph Lycett. McPhee concludes that the Van Diemen's Land Company was using Lycett's view, quote, "as they were probably intended, a promotional brochure to encourage investment in Australian and in particular Tasmanian pastoral activity." It is perhaps ironic, given the artist's repeated convictions for forgery, that he might have been complicit in a fraud perpetrated at a much higher and more sophisticated level, to represent Van Diemen's Land as a land empty of anyone who might stand in the way of colonial success, when in fact this couldn't be further from the truth. The landscape painting of John Glover is well known for the inclusion of Aboriginal figures in his paintings. Glover almost single-handedly reverses the absence of Tasmanian Aborigines from landscape painting when he arrives in Van Diemen's Land. He arrives at the end of the Black War in 1831, and this is critical. His most celebrated painting is probably Mount Wellington and Hobart from Kangaroo Point. The thriving industry of Hobart Town, its port bustling with ships, and its houses reaching upward into the valleys and foothills of Mount Wellington, is bathed in morning light, signalling a prosperous future. In the foreground is juxtaposed a group of Tasmanian Aboriginal people caught in the act of wild celebration as they dance and luxuriate around the campfire, enjoying the spoils of the hunt and swimming joyfully in the waters of the river. But it's a bizarre scene, as there is surely nothing to celebrate. The growth of Hobart in the distance has only been possible through the destruction of their culture and their dispossession of the land. This scene, painted in 1835, is a fantasy. The only place where Tasmanian Aborigines could gather in such numbers now was in forced exile on Flinders Island, and there was little cause for celebration there. Once Aboriginal people had been confined to permanent offshore detention at Waibelena on Flinders Island, official and public taste allowed for artists to promote their craft with depictions of Aboriginal people for the first time. In 1845, John Skinner Prout and Simpkinson de Wesselo made an extraordinary excursion to Flinders Island to paint and draw the Aboriginal survivors of Tasmania's Black War. And these two images are drawn from works that are part of the Royal Society's collection. I emphasise the Royal Society's collection. Along with Glover, artists such as Prout, Gould and Mary Allport immediately took advantage of this shift towards a melancholic memorialisation of Aborigines in their natural surroundings. For the first time, critically after the end of the Black War, Aboriginal people began to appear in colonial landscapes as they had appeared in New South Wales landscapes for at least 30 years prior to this. All of this occurred against a backdrop of persistent attitudes that considered Aborigines in Australia, and Tasmania in particular, to be incapable of participating in the colonial process of civilisation, hence their banishment to Flinders Island. This persistence of Dampier's characterisation of the ignoble savage, coupled with settler paranoia resulting from the resistance that Aboriginal people put up to the invasion of their land, soon transformed not only into a desire for their complete disappearance, but active measures to achieve this. The story of visual representation of Tasmanian Aborigines in early 19th century landscape paintings is therefore an ambiguous one, in which perversely the original occupants are referred to by their absence. As John Berger argues, it is seeing which establishes our place in the surrounding world. We explain that world within words, but words can never undo the fact that we are surrounded by it. The relation between what we see and what we know is never settled. The assumption of Terra nullius by Cook on his arrival in Tasmania created an appetite for the disappearance of Aborigines even before the process of colonisation was begun. Once this process had commenced, correspondence and reports that Aborigines were not acting in a way consistent with what might be expected of parlous savages with no sense of history or home, but instead were actively defending their country, were countered with a visual rhetoric that denied this reality. The landscape painters of Van Diemen's Land before Glover were complicit in this. Once Aboriginal people were safely imprisoned on Flinders Island, it was no longer necessary to hide their presence. Ironically, it was only after their bodily removal from the landscape that Glover was able to reinscribe them into the colony's visual life, but as a memorial, a kind of melancholy expression of regret at the sad but inevitable necessity that Dampier's miserable savages were destined to yield to colonial progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for that marvellous talk. Are you happy to answer a few questions?
Yes, of course.
Yes, thank you. So we do have a roving mic, so if you have a question, if you'd like to indicate, and a mic will come to you. If you do have a question, please indicate and a roaming mic will come to you.
No food will be served until we have at least 2 questions.
Well, I have to say, Greg, you've given us all a great deal of food for thought, and I, for one, will never look at a landscape painting in the same way again. I would have your words echoing in my mind. And
it shouldn't really be surprising that there were visual means of communicating strategic official strategies in the late 1700s and 1800s. I mean, we're surrounded by it today, and it's nothing new. I've referred to it in my talk as visual rhetoric. Another word for it is propaganda. Another word for it is advertising.
Was there a point at which, so Glover started to reintroduce Aboriginal people into his paintings, was there a point at which it kind of started to, in the 1840s or 50s or 60s, what was the point at which Aboriginal people started to disappear from the landscapes again?
So the question is, Aboriginal people were reinscribed into the landscape in the early 1830s through to the mid-1840s. At what time did Aboriginal people disappear again from Tasmanian landscapes? And I mean, this is it's a very, very acute observation. If one thinks about Pigonese landscapes, for example, Tasmania's first native-born great landscape painter, there's no reinscription, romantic memorialising presence of Aboriginal people. I think a number of things were happening. I think there was a shifting relationship with landscape. I think the colony was probably starting to feel confident enough to be able to celebrate that experience of the sublime, and perhaps in those early paintings we start to see the beginnings of concepts of wilderness, and of course what we now celebrate as one of the defining characteristics of Tasmania. Interestingly though, wilderness is still in many people's minds considered to be a place of human emptiness. And of course anyone who knows a bit about Tasmania's fire ecology will know that Aboriginal people were actively managing the landscape right across the island. The other factor that was at play, I think, was the widespread knowledge that that Aboriginal people had been exiled to Flinders Island, and in some ways I think combined with, particularly with the death of Truganini and that widespread myth that she symbolised the complete passing of a people and a culture, I think perhaps to use, or to misquote John Howard, people just got on with it. And getting on with things is in many people's minds what Australia should still be doing. Although thankfully I think reconciliation has now given us all the courage and the will to want to establish a much more honest and powerful relationship with our past.
Thank you. Ross, just wait for the microphone to come. That's good. Thank you.
Oh, Greg, yeah, that was terrific. Do you think there's a factor also in that some artists are reluctant to paint humans into their landscape, in that they don't feel confident in being able to depict the human in the landscape, whatever sort of human it might be?
That's definitely a possibility, Ross. The problem with that is that the artists that I used to as part of my argument were artists who commonly, almost in an obligatory way, included Aboriginal figures in their colonial landscape scenes in New South Wales. But every single one of those artists, without exception, when they came to Van Diemen's Land, didn't include Aboriginal figures. So I don't think it was because they were uncomfortable painting human figures. People often criticise Glover's Aboriginal figures in his paintings. I think next time you're in an art gallery, and Queen Victoria Museum has got a great Glover up there, spend a little bit of time and take a closer look at the detail that Glover has invested in these figures. They're not anatomically, they're not too bad, but he's invested a huge amount of life and culture into these figures.
It's interesting that Glover's depiction of the eucalypts is always out of character of what we know about eucalypts. It's one of the defining features of his paintings. He never really captured them, did he?
Well, there are many people who have that view. I'm sorry to be so contrary with you. I'm not picking on you. I don't share that view, but I think that's more as a result of my eye rather than any objective scientific morphological assessment of the growth habits of eucalyptus. I think I've always just been completely fascinated by Glover's paintings, and I wonder whether my eye in viewing the real landscape has actually been influenced by Glover's somewhat, I don't know, I think perhaps exaggerated. You do see these serpentine limbs, particularly up in the Northern Midlands, and I think Glover grabbed hold of that and used it as perhaps in a slightly exaggerated form, as a marker of place, because there was nowhere else in the British Empire where trees such as this could be imagined. So, yeah, the artists are tricky creatures.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have a question, but just on that point, David Hanson points out that the sinuous character of Glover's trees isn't peculiar just to his paintings in Tasmania, that in fact there are precedents to it in paintings he did in England, and there are also precedents to it in other painters of the same time who influenced Glover. So it's more exaggerated in the Tasmanian paintings, but it's not completely unprecedented.
Yeah. Look, you're absolutely right, Jeff, and there are lots of examples. I mean, the human figure in so-called Mannerist paintings, not particularly anatomically correct. John Webber is a very good example in the Australian context. The figures that he painted had strangely elongated torsos. But these are things that are responses to taste and fashion, perhaps kicked off by a particularly inept artist who somehow or another became celebrated and set a trend. Who knows?
Can I just add something? This is sort of more of a question. I mean, it strikes me that one way of understanding European engagement with indigenous peoples is the extent to which they're seen as merely part of nature, merely as part of a natural landscape. Now, when they are seen that way, there's already a tendency to set them apart from the human, if you like, right? Because they're merely a part of nature. They're not civilised in the standard way of understanding it. Yeah. But of course, once indigenous peoples take arms, once they become, if you like, once they participate in martial action, if you like, then it's very hard to see them simply as part of nature. And so another way of reading this would be to say that in the period you're looking at, Aboriginal people were not could no longer be seen as part of nature, because so they couldn't be seen simply as, decorative elements within a natural scene, if you like. They become very, very different. In the New South Wales context, you might then argue that Indigenous people in the New South Wales context can appear as part of nature and therefore as no more threatening than the rest of nature. So that might provide another way of interpreting some of what's going on, in addition to the intention, specifically the deliberately propagandist elements that are at work here.
Look, I think that's quite a lyrical analysis. I love the idea of Aboriginal people emerging out of a unity with nature in the European imagination. Once people asserted their ability to act with critical agency against the empire. I think you and I should write a joint paper on this, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I can see some other people. One final question. Thank you.
I was wondering if you could extend your thesis to the artists that accompanied the French explorers, Labillardière and Baudin, that painted quite a lot of Aboriginal figures, but they were looking at the land not so much as real estate, but as a wild landscape.
In a slightly extended version of this lecture, or perhaps over a series of lectures, you notice I did start with the French, and part of the response to your question is in the difference between the view of Aboriginal people, the quite crude and utilitarian view that Dampier, and people don't realise how influential Dampier was. Everyone was quoting him. The French were quoting him, but they had Rousseau and other philosophers and novelists, Voltaire, for example. Any Voltaire fans, readers in the room? There's a short story called L'Ingénu, which is about a man who turns out to be a native from Brittany, who comes back from the French colonies in North America and is celebrated as Huron, who were First Nations people who were allied with the French in their war against the British. So I think it's these complexities of relationship, and the French had an investment, a romantic, you might argue, investment in seeing certain aspects of Aboriginal people as symbolising things that were held as noble and in some ways superior to the state that Europeans had descended to in their mad scramble for power and property. I'm not sure whether that completely answers your question, but the French certainly did engage with Aboriginal people quite differently. People often say to me, "Oh, do you think it would have been better if the French had colonised Van Diemen's Land?" I mean, it may well have happened if the British hadn't scrambled to send the Lady Nelson down here when they heard that the French were in these waters. But I think you need to ask Kanaka people that question. They probably would point to the French as being just as capable of oppression as the British, just with a style. Panache.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you to everyone for their questions. And I see many more people around the room looking very thoughtful. So Greg will be with us for the duration of the dinner, and if you think of some other things you'd like to discuss with Greg later, please do. So Greg, as a token of thanks, I'm presenting you with one of the Royal Society's publications, The Library at the End of the World. Now, this is not our most recent publication, but it is the one most closely allied with art, being a book about natural history illustrations from items held in the Royal Society Library at UTas. And I have to say, this book has become very dear to the hearts of the Royal Society because it was the primary sources found in our library that helped us to regain our art collection. And I'd like you all to notice this little picture of the thylacines. You'll be hearing more about that in due course. And one of the editors of this book, Dr. Anita Hansen, is with us tonight. And when Anita was researching this book, one of the things that she found was an inscription in one of the loose volumes of John Gould's Mammals of Australia, that certain animal plates missing from the volume were loaned to TMAG in 1924 for an exhibition in 1925, and they hadn't ever made their way home. But they will be making their way home very shortly. So we'll always look at this book with different eyes, and I hope that you do too, Greg, in reading it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg.